Hello, everybody, and welcome again to the Neurodiversity Gold podcast with me, Jude Morrow. And announcements at the top of the episode. We are streaming all the episodes onto the podcast page, which is neurodiversitygoldpodcast.com. And the podcast is available everywhere where you get your podcasts: Apple, Amazon, Spotify, various other outlets, just to let you know where the podcast is. And also, because it's my podcast, we're not governed by producers or we haven't sold our souls to sponsorship. I'm going to plug my debut novel, which is called The Ghosts of
Oh,
Brian's Craft.
congratulations.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. It's on Amazon now, so I'm plugging that now. And this week's episode is a guest episode again, and we're here to talk about something a bit different, okay? Because I'm going to say something at the top of the episode, and I'm just going to say it. It's just a hashtag, just saying, where whenever you look at arenas like LinkedIn, where the conversation is all very much the same. It's the same topics, it's the same things, and it's a collection of different people saying what is in essence the same thing. And I'll not lie, it's getting a bit tiring to me now, where I think the conversation needs to evolve, it needs to change, and it needs to cover a lot more kind of broader topics than it was given, because you get the usuals like in the workplace and late diagnoses and everything else. And this episode, we're going to focus on a couple of different things: intersectionality, self-inquiry, spirituality, neurodivergence, and mental health. And I'm delighted to welcome on, all the way from down under, Benjamin Christmas. Benjamin, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me, Jude.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. You know what? As whenever we were kind of finalizing our guests for the season, I thought, wow, this is a breath of fresh air from across the world. And whenever we get the guests on, we ask, what do you want to talk about, kind of thing. So the first kind of topic I wanted to touch on was spirituality, where for me, kind of spirituality has become a kind of new thing in my life, especially over the last 12 to 18 months. So, as far as kind of your personal journey and your sort of spiritual journeys involving neurodivergence, how do they intertwine?
How do they intertwine? Can I ask one question before I answer the question? Is what is spirituality the first thing, like before your interest in it? What was like your initial reaction? Was it like, no, thank you, or bit woo-woo?
Absolutely was. For me, I'm a very literal person. If I can't see it, it doesn't exist. And it was a challenge for me kind of growing up in a Catholic school and a Catholic faith where it's very guilt driven. And I suppose over the years, God and spirituality was kind of put in the same compartmentalized box as fairies and unicorns. So that's kind of my own personal kind of
It sounds
spirituality.
rather similar to me, except I wasn't born into the lovely Catholic faith. I was born into the realms of Pentecostalism. But rather than speak about Christendom, I'm actually far more interested in spirituality. But to answer your question, how do they two meet up, I guess? I think for me, it's been a case of discovering one whilst holding on to the other. And I grew up in a fundamentally it was a very ultra conservative household, and particularly when it came to the belief system. So I also grew up late diagnosis, so I never had an idea that the things that I felt and saw internally were actually there's been ways of describing that, and I was never given an opportunity to get diagnosed. I never knew that the things that interest me or the things that I saw were maybe a part of my neurodivergency. I just thought everyone else did it. And going through those, sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, no, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were finished. I think we might have a bit of a delay on the line, but it doesn't matter.
The distance in between.
Yeah.
And I think for me, like I've relied on that my whole life. And what I've relied on is just the sense that I know that there's something much greater out there. That's what I used to rely on as a child. And I just knew that the complexity of life was probably far more than we could ever really know. So that's kind of what I relied on. It's a bit of a mix of, belief system inherited from the parents and trauma and growing up as a undiagnosed autistic kid. But I also grew up queer, and that was also pretty hard. And the intersectionality of it all, you think that when you're growing through it and experiencing all these different things, you generally think they all operate in isolation from each other. I go to church, I have a belief, or I have a spiritual sort of practice. I'm also disabled in a particular way, or I have a neurodivergent trait. And then you go on to maybe learn about your life in a different way, in terms of maybe going to university. So it's really quite you've got something to put your teeth into. But like, where does spirituality really, what does it mean? What does it all fit in? I think primarily it's that yearning that we all have, right? Like, we all kind of are. If everyone was to really stop, even the most busy, successful, out there people, people that you'd never thought maybe are spiritual or seemed rather typical in their belief system, there's still that yearning though. And it could be various subtypes of yearning, I guess, but there's that yearning of belonging, and that yearning for love and acceptance. And I think that's what bears out of people then entering into that spirituality. It's not so dogmatic either. You can take or leave it. You can take parts that work for you, but it's not necessarily what it means to me, and I guess what it means to a lot of people with neurodivergency. It's just the place, finding a place of acceptance, but also inner peace, having gone through a lot of trauma and a lot of environmental hostility, like everywhere you go. So there's like something that we need to grasp onto in order to survive. And I think it's, one, a product of survival, but two, maybe also a product of our neurodivergency, which is probably quite a long conversation in and of itself.
I was thinking that it would be a really, really long conversation, because I think, kind of as a sweeping statement, right, where a lot of kind of scientific logical mindsets exist among the neurodivergent community. And from what I've seen, there doesn't seem to be a lot of kind of, room for spiritualism. So I suppose, in a way, I would presume that you're in a minority. I mean, how are you in contact or working with other kind of spiritual neurodivergence as well?
I would hazard to say that you're right and wrong, only in the sense that there's plenty of people that are working in those fields but don't know they're neurodivergent. And I mean that in the sense of, like, naturally, a neurodivergent person, generally autistic, and the various lexias that we have and what have you in the syndromes, you generally like to drift towards a situation or a workplace or a space, community space or something like that has structure. There is order. And it's not so much to then use that for an advantage or know how to navigate. It's more that there's a bit of a foundation we can fall back on if we have no idea what the hell's going on. That's generally what autistic people are like. We're just, the clarifying questions that we constantly spew out are just that. It's just clarifying. Like, we just want to make sure, and I think making sure is probably also an apt way of probably describing things. It's like that little internal, is everything okay? Like, are we going to be all right? Is everything going to work out? That yearning. And I think that, you talk about, there's a lot of neurodivergence that are in science and in data. A lot of the scientists that we've had of the past, neurodivergent. Just look at their behaviors and the way that they used to operate within society and their kind of eccentric lifestyles. I would hazard to guess a lot of our famous musicians were neurodivergent. Mozart and Beethoven, just two. That's kind of what I'm getting at, but also we also, as neurodivergent people, get stuck in the cultural context in which we're born. and which we experience, and then we see the world as well through that lens. So if you're someone born, maybe a generation ago, prior to the lovely millennials, where it was very much more so based in, the cultural zeitgeist was, the evolution debate. It was the, whether there is even the idea of global warming. And I know in my religious circles, it was very much a time of Armageddon. So, which is still going apparently. Anyway, but that's what I'm kind of getting at. There's a lot of people that are also within those religious, dogmatic, spiritual circles that are neurodivergent, don't know it, have gone into those spaces, those environments, because they are also neurodivergent. They naturally find themselves, they have an affinity towards it. That's why, like, you see a lot of doctors and a lot of medical staff and technicians who work in hospitals, high protocoled, procedural, processed environments where there's a procedure for everything. There's a high proportion of neurodivergent individuals working within those spaces. So yeah, I wouldn't hazard to guess that a lot of the people that have either maybe written some parts of holy texts in the various cultures were neurodivergent.
I would agree with you there. Like I always say, any of the kind of like live shows and the like talks and stuff that I give, I always make a point of saying that the most kind of creative and ambitious people ever were neurodivergents. And another kind of thing that kind of drew me into having you on the show is that we didn't have anybody from kind of down under in the last season of the podcast.
Ah,
And I suppose what I wanted to know was, what does the ND scene like down there?
non-existent.
That was the exact same word that was used. Now, please forgive me, the guest who is probably listening. I do not recall her name, but she was on the show. I think it was the first season. This is season 3. And I said,
Okay.
what's the ND scene like down there? And she said the same thing, non-existent.
Mm,
So here's an interesting thing, right? Where if you were to have a magic wand
mm.
and say, okay, I can do one thing to boost the ND scene in Australia, what would that be? How beefy is that for a question?
Yeah, well, that's kind of ironic because I'm actually writing I'm trying to attempt to write something for what is the last hearing at our Disability Royal Commission. So in Australia, we have these government sort of, I don't know how, it's quite Australian, and I'm sure various parts of Europe, Ireland, and the UK would have similar things, but essentially it's like a publicly appointed third party, in terms of like a judge or someone like that, who basically goes to investigate via the public, holding public committees on a particular issue that's important to the community. So at the moment, we have a couple of royal commissions going, one on veteran suicides, one on a Centrelink debt scheme, which is our welfare debt scheme. And another one is the Disability Royal Commission into abuse, neglect, and I forgot the other part to it. But essentially, it's a Royal Commission into disability. And it's a opportunity for everyone who has either undergone abuse or what have you, or their experience, or what they would like to see happen in response to a particular thing, in regards to disability. They're able to speak to that, and that's experts, community members, leaders, victims, everyone. And the last one is a vision for a future Australia. And I thought that's something I could probably speak to, because I'm more than happy to have a cry and talk about my life, but how depressing. I would prefer maybe to, like, let's talk about something that's going to make everyone hope and have faith in the future that we could possibly have a hand in creating. And for me, the one thing to answer a very, very, very short question in a very, very long way would be to have a national sort of conversation around autism and neurodivergency. And what I mean by that is that there is like the public broadcaster gets tasked by the government to say, let's have a community televised, over a period of time in different places and towns about neurodivergency and mental health. That's what I would do. Conversation.
Brilliant. So hopefully the conversation accelerates, because we do work on pretty much every continent. I mean, with NTI, like, we have marketing clients pretty much everywhere. Like, we're working with coaches and mentors and schools and corporations pretty much everywhere. And there are certain regions that, certainly from an observational point of view, and because we're in those spaces, some are much, much further behind others. And I know in Australia, the ABA lobby is very, very big, and quite powerful, which is really quite annoying, because I take the opportunity to say it any time I can on the podcast, is that
I'm glad you're bringing it up.
ABA was created by the same person that created gay conversion therapy. And how ABA is not illegal or banned or related as abuse, I don't know. And hopefully we're on the right path, I think, in kind of getting behavioral engineering removed. But a big part of your journey has been intersectionality. I mean, realizing that you were queer and getting on with your life with kind of like that intersectional kind of neurodivergent kind of queer aspect. So I suppose from your point of view, I mean, how has that been? How has that kind of manifested, for want of a better word?
Well, the first one that came to my mind was SHT. But at the same time, like, that's my initial knee-jerk reaction. Only in the sense that I'm able to look back and realize so many things about myself and how none of it was really anything I could control. But it was also the environment. It was hostile, every part of it. It's like school, home, and then you've got church and just the general region and the regional country living and the culture, living in the country my whole life, and growing up as at the time identifying as gay and just trying to navigate acceptance of myself, my belief. The irony is, like, one of the biggest things about this conversation around intersectionality is how and like, sorry to use a pun, but they're interlinked. But by interlinked, it's like one becomes before the other. Like my growing up, I got told by the church, you've chosen a lifestyle. Coming from somebody that was having grown up and was very much in that environment all the time, you start to, oh, okay. It's like you don't argue, but at the same time, it leaves a little bit of a, like, eventually, like, oh, well, if I chose this, how do I unchoose it? And you can't, because it's a product of your neurodivergency, which is a product of your brain, either environmentally or in nurture and environment within the womb, genetics as well, all having a particular flavor that leads to you being autistic. And even then, the descriptor autistic, neurodivergency, divergency in brain development, it's been going on since we were humans, like we're Homo sapiens and all the. I think it's just a bit of a redundant argument in regards to whether it's real or not, it's an actual thing, and whether you've chosen something. And like, to think that, just looping back to the ABA and Dr. Ivar Lovaas, I have had brushes with certain things of a similar ilk, and it's also banned in majority of states in Australia, conversion therapy. However, it's still happening in Australia. And it's still happening in the context of it's hidden, it's covert now in churches. It's made out to be something that it isn't. And it's also made out to be something wholly different. They'll use different language, they'll change their language, what have you. And that's the part that scares me, but also the part that now we have on a federal level recognition of applied behavior analysis. Now, if anyone had spent maybe 5 minutes in the federal government to have a look on YouTube, go watch a documentary that's got actual footage of Dr. Lovaas working. And sit with how it makes you feel. Now go watch a Jesus camp documentary or something like that, a conversion camp documentary, and see how that makes you feel. And notice how it's exactly the same thing. It's probably what I find a little bit worse is that ABA is done to children, and it's done in a way where they are essentially made to and adapt to conditions that were essentially predicated on theories based around animals, cats and dogs. And if we want to go further, it's actually based in white supremacist and eugenic thought and philosophy. You don't have to go back very far. So yeah, the intersection is not only real in terms of our own biological inner and outer experience, but the environment is also hostile to that and to the very experience that we're trying to be honest to and genuine to. So that's when we all love to mask and change ourselves and everything like that. And don't get me wrong, it's not in a way that's conscious either.
And you know what? Whenever you're saying about the Lovaas documentaries and the Jesus Camp documentaries, what marketing companies tend to do, right? And take it from me, or basically what we are as a marketing agency is whenever it's recognized publicly that something is bad for your health, right? And I'll use 2 examples, right? Cigarette smoking and Coca-Cola, right? Now to avoid now not the cigarettes one, but definitely with Coca-Cola. Everything is healthy in moderation, blah, 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 blah. This is not an attack on Coca-Cola. Please do not sue the knickers off me, right? But whenever it became sort of more widely spread that cigarette smoking and Coca-Cola in vast amounts was bad for your health, what they did was bring out Marlboro Lights. What they did was bring out Diet Coke. And I mean, whilst Diet Coke, yes, is certainly nowhere near on the calorific sugar level as Coca-Cola. I mean, it's certainly not good for your health. Drink gallons and gallons of it every day. Where that's what they've done with ABA as well, with this other bullshit like positive behavioral support and all this other things. Where it's ABA lights, Diet ABA. That's basically what they're doing. And
well, you can polish a turd. It's still a turd.
Yeah, you can. You can.
Where people say
you can't, but you can.
Yeah, and at any rate, like, why are you trying to adjust something that obviously is based in a racist white supremacist structure? You can't change that. You can't change the fact that it was born out of a person that was inherently looking to change the behaviors of others through experimentation that he thought. So that's the key phrase. He believed and he thought he knew what the right behavior was. What is right behavior?
I don't know.
Exactly. No one knows other than what the community consensus is to whatever we're feeling irritated about at the time. Like it's nonsensical. I actually tried to do probably once or twice or 3 times now, try to find where his actual original research papers are located and what sort of evidence was drawn up to. I can't find it. Everyone references the reference and the citations of the citation of the citation, and they all these papers that talk to the astutedness of this doctor. They all reference this massive body of work that's well acclaimed, but can anyone find it?
I
No.
don't know. And you know what? This is like an open call. I'm going to turn this into an open call. Is if you have these papers, please contact the show through the website, neurodiversitygoldpodcast.com, or contact me through LinkedIn because I've never seen it. It's one of those things that came up in conversation a few years back with us here, and
Mm-hmm.
we didn't find anything since. So well, you know what? We'll see if we get something back. But as for you, I mean, you've been through a lot. You've overcome a lot of challenges. You've reframed your thinking, on yourself. It's kind of like that ND rite of passage, where I mean, are you using kind of that knowledge, skills, and journey to help other people now?
Um, I will always endeavor to help other people, and I think people know that from the interactions I've had with me on my profile on LinkedIn. Ultimately, that's what I would like to do in a so I would like to work towards the position of like a spiritual scientist, someone that really, well, I'm not interested in anything woo-woo, anything that's not based in some form of logical and there's some form of evidence base, or at the very least there's an interesting question to be asked.
Yeah.
But yeah, like for me, I guess I want to help as many people as I can, but I also recognize that, and this is what I try to speak to on LinkedIn a lot, is that we have a lot of, I'll talk about this particular concept that I've developed a little bit, and I call it the germination of obligation. And essentially, it's that feeling every autistic person has whenever they perceive or have, in reality, an expectation given to them. And the perception of this obligation is perhaps the 80% part, like the part that takes up the majority of the effort, because we're constantly perceiving that we need to help other people. And I mean that in the sense that it's just like we just want to make others feel safe, how we would like to feel, right? And I think we get caught up in doing that so often that we forget, oh, we're also going to do that for ourselves. And by doing that, that's the hardest part, because you're having to refamiliarize yourself with yourself, but also find a way to self-soothe, find a way to find those inner peaceful places. And I guess that's what I want to talk about and help people with, is that like you just mentioned it, that rite of passage. I think a lot of us, when we reach a level in our lives, having been undiagnosed, I think many will reach a point where it hasn't, it's like you have the bell curve of effort, and the bell curve didn't really curve out. It kept going up like a roller coaster. And that's essentially like you got to a point where you just flew off the roller coaster, and then now you're suddenly flying in the sky and you're wondering, when does this ride end? And you eventually do, it does, and it usually ends in a spectacular way, because you usually explode or implode, I think for me, I can look back now and see the steps that built up to that. But I also found that spirituality gave me the first look in just prior to my diagnosis, which was, and my mental health getting poor was the impetus for seeking it, is that the spirituality portion of my life, but also looking at the Taoism, looking at Zen, looking at the commonalities between all the faiths and philosophies, looking at near-death experiences, looking at all those different things. I actually found an inner peace that was able to take away that ruminatory thought, that overthinking, that stress, before I even had my diagnosis. And I feel like I was lucky enough to be given that, because if I'd experienced it after medication and diagnosis, I wouldn't have given it as much weight as I do now. So that's what I would like to do, hopefully one day, is help others find that little spiritual corner that they might not be so familiar with in themselves. It's there.
Absolutely. And what I will say, Benjamin, as well, is any way I or the NTI team can help you, we absolutely will. I think it's a great area. You're changing the conversation. It's something different. It's something that I think is needed because
Yeah.
the majority of neurodivergence or a good portion of neurodivergence aren't really in the spiritual realm. There's not really a serving kind of entity like you to kind of meet that need. So I really hope that is something that you consider and that you proceed with. But for anybody listening that wants to get in touch with you, how do people do that?
I just have to find me on LinkedIn. And my email is bdchristmas@gmail.com. Feel free to give me an email.
And by the way, see as far as your last name, is it two S's or is that just a
Oh, and
typo?
it is two S's. So it's just think of Christ and Mass and then shove them together and put @gmail.com and you've got it.
Happy days. Benjamin, this has been an absolutely fantastic discussion. I mean, this could really have kind of enveloped into a 4-hour special because there's so much more, but we'll definitely get you back on again for
Love
the
to.
next season or the season afterward. And I want to say thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everybody for listening to us. And we will see you again next week for another episode of the Neurodiversity Gold Podcast.